So in our regular conversations on this topic, Chris and I had the following set of questions emerge time and again. What are the roots of this seemingly intractable problem? Why have reforms generally failed to achieve desired results? What would different approaches to criminal safety, or community safety look like? What promise do ongoing efforts in communities across the country hold for real and sustained change? And finally, what considerations should guide our evaluations of these efforts? To get answers to these questions, we have invited practitioners, policymakers, community leaders and activists, and academics to PCJ to share their unique insights, in many cases drawn from decades of experience and engagement on various aspects of this issue. While the list for the spring semester is still a work in progress, we are thrilled by the speakers we have lined up for this fall. To that end, I am honored to introduce our inaugural speaker, Ronald L. Davis. Ron is currently partner of 21CP Solutions, an organization that seeks to empower communities across the country to develop and implement equitable and integrity-driven public safety grounded in trust and strong relationships. As a former police officer with the Oakland Police Department and chief of police of East Palo Alto Police Department, Ron established a stellar reputation as an innovator of community policing efforts. He was known for working collaboratively with the community to dramatically reduce crime and violence in a city that had come to be known the most violent, or the murder capital of the US. His exceptional commitment to justice and equally impressive outcomes led to service in the Obama administration as the director of the United States Department of Justice Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, also known as the COPS Office. He served between 2013 and 2017. The COPS Office is responsible for advancing community policing nationwide, and it manages over $1.2 billion in federal grants to support the community policing activities for approximately 18,000 local, state, and tribal law enforcement agencies. Ron also has strong ties with HKS. He served as a member of the prestigious Harvard University and NIJ executive sessions on policing and public safety, and completed the senior executives in state and local government program at HKS as well. If I were to go on to describe the many reports that Ron has co-authored and the number of awards and recognition that he's received over the past 35 years, we would really be here all day. And so I'm going to stop and not do that. Instead, I'd like to welcome back to HKS, Ron L. Davis. And to do this, I want you to kind of unmute, then we can clap so Ron knows how enthusiastic we are about him being here. And then I want you to mute again so that we can continue on. So.
Hey, Ron. Welcome back.
Thank you all for that. So Ron and I will converse for about 30 minutes. Then I will turn it over to Chris Winship, who will perhaps share a few thoughts and ask a question or two of his own. And he will do that for about 5 minutes. And at that point, we will turn it over to the audience around 5:15 for a 30-minute Q&A. So, okay, let's get started. Ron, let's begin where I guess the drama of the summer began. In the aftermath of Floyd's killing, there were widespread protests against police brutality and other racial inequities across the country, and indeed the world. Soon after protests began, you had an interview with the Bay Area's public radio station, KQED, a favorite of mine. You mentioned feeling optimistic about the possibilities for real and sustained change. Please tell us why, and then, given strong and often violent counter-mobilizations and corresponding declining support for BLM, tell us how much your optimism remains and why it has.
So let me start by thanking you for the invitation to speak. It is always a pleasure to come to Harvard. I see, I'm gonna get in trouble, but I'm gonna do this anyway. I see a couple of faces from iconic figures and mentors of mine. So I'll see Chris Stone trying to hide, Frank Hartman and Malcolm Sparrow and a few others. Thank you so much for participating. I see a good colleague, Brenda Ford Forte out there. Thank you for being here. I think after 35 years of direct law enforcement and also working for the feds, I go back to the time of Rodney King and probably even before that. And I think about every time we've had these tragedies that they have sparked different moments in time. What makes me feel optimistic right now is that this feels a little bit different than a moment in time. This seems like a new movement. It feels like this is that people want something different. I don't think it's because things are different as much as people are now aware of what many have been talking about. Communities of color have been crying about for years, the systemic and structural racism that still exists in policing. It's hard to ignore that when you watch 8 minutes or 46 seconds of just pure dehumanization and killing of another human being. It's kind of hard to ignore, to see other officers stand by and not intervene or engage. It's hard to ignore. When I look at the diversity of those that are protesting, it brings me optimism that this is, quite frankly, just not a Black thing, that this is now an American issue with the recognition that the criminal justice system, especially policing, requires pretty transformational change. And so I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic also because the 10 years before this, I think there's been so much work being done. So although we've been reforming for 30 or 40 years, there have been a lot of advancements. We're starting to get more evidence-based. We're starting to engage in more research. We're starting to learn more from each other. We're starting to increase some levels of accountability. I don't think it's been enough. I think we've been tinkering around the edges for too long. I think we need to reconstruct the system. But I see what happens when we focus and we're committed to a certain path. And right now, I feel that we're there. So that leaves me optimistic. The idea, the counter argument or the violence that we're seeing, well, one thing we do know is following all racial unrest, we've seen community violence go up, unfortunately, in most cases. We know that violence is cyclical, and I think that cannot be a distraction to the root causes of why we're here to begin with. I think there are those who want us to be distracted by protests and demonstrations that turn into riots, into community violence, because if we keep getting distracted and take our eyes off the root cause issue, then we're always going to be doing whack-a-mole with issues that occur. So although there's some opposition, there's always opposition. When you're talking about fighting for people's civil rights and human dignity, there's always going to be opposition. And so I think that's where we're at right now, but it leaves me just so optimistic because of what I'm seeing, and I see where the movement is headed.
Yeah. So let me just follow up then. I completely hear you. We should expect these counter mobilizations to happen. It's a very typical thing to have happen in these situations. Support for the Black Lives Matter movement remains extraordinarily high among Black Americans. So it's in the 80s range. It's declined about 10% for Latinos, and for whites, it's at least declined about 15%. So we see the marching downward trend for whites and Latinos, which would seem to put at risk this kind of multiracial movement that seemed to be developing over the summer. Does that concern you at all?
Well, I tell you what concerns me is if we don't take advantage of the opportunity. The shifting in polling, the shifting in views, I think mirrors the shifting in our politics. In other words, the reduction was a outcome of a targeted strategy to focus on riots, civil unrest, and to link Black Lives Matter to that so that the American people would pull support away from that. So it doesn't surprise me that it went down, but I think more and more people are understanding what Black Lives Matter means. I think initially when it first came out, people were so quick to come up with All Lives Matter. And I think they didn't realize what the Black Lives Matter really means, that there's a silent two, T-O-O, Black Lives Matter too. Not that Black lives are more important or less important, but we also matter. And I think all the evidence now is showing that there's a legitimate reason why we believe that. And so I'm concerned about the polling in the sense that people want to distract, but I still think that the outcome has been more and more people understand the concept. I think even police are starting to understand it better. And I've seen police officers now take a knee. I've seen chiefs take a knee. Now my concern with that is that people will take a knee, not just because it de-escalates a demonstration, but because they're now going to make a commitment to do some transformational changes. And so that they're ready not to just take a knee for racial justice, but to actually take a stance. That would be the better idea. But I still leaves me optimistic that at least we can recognize and say that word without fear. At least we know that most people now understand what is meant by that. and that is not something that is a negative. And I think the more we understand Black lives, the more, and this is going to, some people are going to get very mad when I say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, the more we reject the notion of blue lives. Because I think blue lives was this notion that police officers are blue. And obviously we're not. What makes the police departments, what should make them strong, is our diversity. And so the need to counter Black lives seemed to be so important at the time that we had to create a whole new group of people. And so the more we understand Black lives, the more we understand the concept of why our lives matter as well, understand our history, why people would feel like we don't matter. Even today's announcement will as a reaffirmation of how much Black lives can matter, that you can have someone be shot 6 times in a building and the only accountability you get is someone will be charged for reckless shooting at another building. And there's a lot of things with that without me providing judgment, but it's just a constant reminder that we have not yet in this country achieved the point where Black lives are considered equal.
Thank you for that. So within 2 weeks of the Floyd killing, you co-authored a New York Times op-ed about how to fix the police, drawing from aspects of the playbook already created by the task force that you directed. It would be great for our audience, I think, for you to elaborate on what you meant by that, what you and your co-authors meant. There's already a playbook that's in existence. If we were to draw from that, we would actually make some progress, is what I got from the op-ed. Can you share with us what you were saying in that, and then maybe perhaps describe the barriers that you see to making or incorporating these reforms, what makes it difficult, and then what strategies might be deployed to overcome these difficulties?
Well, let me start with this, this idea of reforming the system. And some people have heard me say this for years, and I think it's more evident today than it has been in the past. And that is that our criminal justice system, I'm gonna focus on our policing system, is not broke. It's working as it was designed to work. It was created as an institution to protect other institutions, ranging from slavery to Jim Crow to Black codes and to this idea of oppressing communities of color. The systems in which we're operating are so deficient and so flawed. They're the same systems that were created in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And if you look at most police departments, they literally will almost look exactly as they did in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Structurally, program-wise, how we fight crime, why we fight crime, how we deploy officers, all those things are tainted by built-in structural racism. So when we talk about reforming the system, I think the first thing we need to recognize is that it's not a question of trying to fix something that's broke because it's not broke, as much as we need to reconstruct a system that does not have structural racism, that is designed for equitable outcomes. Because without it, bad systems mean that even good cops have bad outcomes and bad cops get to operate with impunity. So in 2014, President Obama, in response to the Michael Ferguson shooting, the Eric Gardner death in New York, and Ferguson and Michael Brown and Ferguson, and the unrest that followed, created the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. The co-authors on our article and I were all involved in that process. I served as the executive director, and a couple of my co-authors were either a member or co-chair, Chuck Ramsey, Sean Smoot, and Roberto Villasenor. And we were pointing to, as we're moving forward, of how to, I won't say reform, but how to enhance policing. I think we need to reimagine, which we'll get into. We need to reconstruct, but whatever the footprint looks like, it definitely needs to operate with the strong systems. That this report provides some good roadmap to start making the kind of changes that will have an immediate impact on the harm that the profession is causing. So we were trying to point out that as we move forward, that maybe we don't need to do a complete reanalysis, that we have some roadmaps, we have some research that's been done over the years. We have a lot of guidance on how to proceed forward. We just need the will, the commitment, and the political support to do so. So
it would be great if we could hear more about this initiative. the 21st Century Policing Initiative, including its origins, well, you kind of shared with us the origins, the development, the key recommendations. There are discussions about these pillars that you suggested that police departments could draw from in order to kind of shape or guide their reforms. And how well do you think thus far, for those places who adopted them, how well do you think it's addressed the issues it was intended to?
Well, I think if anyone that's worked in DC knows that, one of the immediate responses to any crisis is you put a task force together, create a great report. It disappears and sits on the shelves for years and years and years. And one of the things that President Obama was clear on is that he did not want that to happen. So the first thing I think he did with the task force that was unique is he gave us 90 days to come up with these recommendations. And at the time, besides thinking that maybe he lost his mind at the time, you're not gonna tell the president that, you're wondering what the heck is 90 days? But it prevented us from getting into the trap of just becoming a think tank and just reevaluating things that we don't need to have discussions about. And it caused us to realize the best way to then proceed forward with 90 days is to have listening sessions around the country and listen to the actual experts that are in the field. Listen to the researchers that are actually doing the research. Listen to the academics that are studying it. Listen to the union that's involved, the police chiefs, the community, civil rights attorneys, families of victims of police violence. Listen to every stakeholder we can listen to so that the recommendations, the solutions now are not dictated to the field. They're coming from the field to help advance the field based on real life experience and research. So that allowed us to be more facilitators in the gathering of information, putting that into a report that is something that would be, we had to make sure, we also had to make it a report that would be easily accessible to the field, that this concept of report that just didn't disappear with the other reports that we generate, had to make it reader friendly. And that's not offered in a condescending ways that police chiefs and those who run organizations don't have time to read 300-page research manuals. So we had to find a way to capture those recommendations and evidence in a way to be able to capture the attention. And then be able to, once we completed the report, through my office at the Department of Justice, is incentivize it by putting about $300 million in grants behind it. So that now grant funding was there to support it. If you wanted to use our money to hire cops, you had to identify, what your priority for that officer was going to be or for the department, and it had to be commensurate with something inside the task force report. So we thought it was moving forward very well, and if agencies embrace it. We had every major law enforcement organization involved by giving them grants to be a part of it. We had just announced initiatives to do pilot sites around the country so that we can track implementation and develop best practices on implementation. And we started to see this concept of moving forward, and we got people to really think of the task force report in a very basic but roadmap way. But all of that stopped with the election. And in 2017, when the new administration came in, not only did they stop the report, candidly, they took the report offline for about 6 months. And so it was just one of those, from a political point of view, it was to stop and undermine and, quite frankly, reverse. So many of the programs that were generated have been eliminated. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're standing here today in the condition we were, because we were heading in a certain direction, but not only did we just stop, we started going back in reverse, going back to this law and order rhetoric of the 80s and 90s, this notion that mass incarceration is the solution to crime and violence. This notion, which is the most shocking thing I've heard in my 35 professional years, that the Attorney General of the United States would suggest there's no structural racism. We're operating at a different level right now that is now suggesting that we're gonna, this is where the article came in the op-ed, we need to go back to those reform models and start engaging the community again as we were before.
So I really very much appreciate that response. It brings us to a place where it makes sense for us to kind of dig into some of the critiques about community policing. So you spent a good part of your 35-year career working on innovating with regards to community policing. But there are some organizations that have thrown a number of critiques, some of them I think quite serious, at this concept, how it's been enacted, even on theoretical grounds, whether or not it's made sense. I'm going to throw at you 4 critiques, and you just let me know if I need to stop and restate or whatever. So one is that community policing is used to bolster the legitimacy of police when they are undermined by protest and crisis. That's when we start to talk about community policing, this touchy-feely, let's get to know the community. Community policing cannot actually solve the problems that cause crime, although I think you might on some level agree with that, but can only displace them temporarily. That community policing is used as an excuse to expand police funding and hiring, give us this money so that we can do these things and really connect with more citizens, residents. And then finally, that community policing extends police presence and surveillance into the everyday life of residents of some communities at least, and it turns social problems into police problems. Those are like 4, I think one of the 4 of the biggest critiques about community policing. And I'm really interested in how you would respond to those.
Let me start by saying that I've heard all 4. And this is going to sound weird. I agree that it has been used as the 4 positions have outlined. And here's why. I think right now the number fluctuates, but right now there's approximately 16,000 local, state, and tribal law enforcement agencies in the United States. We're an extremely decentralized system. We don't have a national police force. We don't have federal regulation per se over local law enforcement. So all these 16,000 agencies are reporting to local jurisdictions, to some type of governing structure, elected structure. If I were to right now survey 16,000 police chiefs and ask them to define community policing, I'd be surprised if we didn't get 16,000 different definitions. And this is something that we have failed to do over the years, is to really understand what is meant. So when many people are talking about community policing, they're talking about community engagement. When many people are talking about community policing, they're talking about community programs. And if you're talking about community programs, then you start getting into the why you do the community programs, right? For example, if I've talked to agencies that say we're doing community policing because we play with the kids, we play basketball with the kids on Saturday. If you're doing stop the frisk on Monday through Friday, then the basketball game is Saturday becomes pretty much irrelevant. It becomes nothing more than you using that concept to provide the legitimacy that you talked about, right? If you are just doing community programs on top of the traditional policing, which I've already suggested is somewhat impacted by structural racism, then you're going to need resources to do that community policing, which means those community programs become excuses for expanded budgets. And in fact, I think the concept was that the cops office was created to add 100,000 more cops because we knew community policing would require them to step out of the car, to engage in the community, right, and to start engaging in problem solving. Where I think the challenge is that for me is defining policing as far as not solving the problem. I don't think the police are designed to solve the problem. The more we rely on them to do that, the more we have the over-reliance of police, and the more we criminalize things that should be socially based or community based. So I think the key with community policing is to look at it as not as a program, not as an initiative, but as an operational philosophy. The concept that the police and the community are co-producers of public safety, right? And frankly, Chris will go back to Sir Robert Peel, that the police is the public is the police, but the police being the ones that the community have empowered to represent their interests in public safety. But it can't be that we're there to solve problems. If you're the co-production, then you help solve problems because you bring resources that can solve problems, right? You can bring the resources with you. Some resources may be everything from job programs to enhance the support for economic growth, for educational systems. The idea that you are one of many entities that go to the safety of the community. And so if you look at community policing that way, then these areas you're talking about won't occur. But when people think of community policing as being a program or some kind of engagement, then you'll start hearing things as, I do community policing and I'll go to a program. Or I can't do community policing right now because I have a spate of violence that's going on, so let me put that to the side, let me get into the stop and frisk. And once I get control of the violence, I'll go back to community policing. And so because of that, it's taken out of, it's distorted. You know, one of the things I would say in law enforcement, you may see this, we don't have the same rules of, what's the word I'm looking for? Plagiarism is alive and well in law enforcement. We're not held to that academic standard where you are supposed to have the economic, the educational, the ethical integrity to, if you're going to take someone's program, you're going to cite it and you're going to try to stay within what they designed for it to be. We'll take words and someone will say community policing and that label will be slapped on 20 different things. And it has nothing to do with community policing. You know, when I think back, one of the biggest programs, and may he rest in peace, was the broken windows theory. And it just drove people crazy, especially the creator of it, is that it was never designed to be a high enforcement, zero tolerance program as much as it was designed that you fix little things before they become big things. And that's true at all parts of life. So the concept is strong. How it was replicated, how it was implemented turned out to be very damaging and caused collateral damage because of this over-policing, over-enforcement. So when I look at community policing, I think we need to get less into that phrase now. And I think we need to take and really change that around to what is community public safety look like? What is it that communities want to make them feel safe? What is it that they need?
Okay, thank you for that. So I think because different entities have taken this label, slapped it onto a programmer, you know, and responded in different ways to the communities that they are expected to serve, and have done so badly. Now, folks, there's a kind of bad reputation associated with community policing, at least in many communities that are suffering in some ways from police brutality and other kinds of inequities. And so now we have these calls to defund the police altogether, just done, sick of them, at least in some ways. So these calls have reverberated across the country. For some, it means disaggregating the police function, and in some ways, I think you described something like that. The term that Barry Friedman from NYU Law uses to describe, you know, police taking on these different functions, and in some cases, allowing others to take these on. For others, it's about police abolition. What are your views on these perspectives? Do you find any value in either approach or somewhere on the continuum of possibilities?
You know, so both concepts are interesting because the terms are used in ways that can be very misleading, can be confusing, and for some communities it can create high levels of fear. So in talking to, and I'm not going to speak for any individual group, but in talking to those that are abolitionists, I would say in talking to them and what their ultimate goal is, that they're probably more reconstructionists. I haven't met too many people to think that you can just get rid of the police and somehow the community will take care of its own safety. And the one or two that have walked through this conversation with me, by the time you finish with them, they realize no matter what angle you come at, whenever you tap somebody in the community to hold someone else accountable as a part of the community on behalf of the community, call them what you want to call them, but they're still police and they're still going to be subject to the same challenges and the same corrupt forces that exist right now. And that the corrupt force, with quite frankly, is power, which I'll get into that for a second. So when I talk to people that defunding, I think some people think that my concern with the phrase as being most often used right now is that it feels to be punitive. In other words, the police have caused harm, so your punishment is for me to take your money, right? Versus those that I talk to that are looking for the idea of we need to reduce the law enforcement footprint. We need to redefine the role of policing in our democracy. We need to evaluate what does community safety look like? And we need to invest in those services that are most likely to give us the highest return of our investment. And those are social and community-based programs. And over the years, and if you do that, then it may start with an investment. And as you reduce the need, then you can then reallocate as you reduce the law enforcement footprint to sustain those efforts. My concern now is if you just arbitrarily defund, tomorrow I'm gonna take $100 million from the police department. Well, I can tell you, not only from a grantor, but a former city manager, you can give me $100 million tomorrow. It's gonna take about 2 or 3 years to absorb it, to build up the organization, to start providing the services that would give you the return on your investment. And so in the meantime, what you are doing is you're basically putting safety at risk. And my big concern is if this experiment of reimagining and this experiment of investing and reallocating is done inappropriately, it will expose communities to increased violence and crime, and people will not only return to where we were before, they'll actually increase the level out of plain fear. We've seen that, and you're gonna have forces trying to do that. So I think when I look at abolitionists and defunding, what I get out of it is that people are recognizing that we have a system right now in which we have over-relied on police to solve a lot of problems. I think the greatest example is mental health. We have deconstructed and defunded the mental health institutions for the last 30, 40 years. As a result of that, people don't get the services they need. Right? They don't get the medication they need, the support they need. And right now, the system, if you think about it, is we have failed them. We as a society, community have failed those in mental health needs. And when it all comes down to where now at 2 o'clock in the morning, this person hasn't been on their meds and they're in a crisis, we then send one of my 25-year-old cops to solve it. And the only thing that cops got on his or her belt is a gun, a taser, and a bunch of weaponry. And then we want this cop to do something that we have failed to do as a society. And then second guess the heck out of it, which we should, when it doesn't go right, when it was inevitably going to go wrong for the moment you dispatched it. In most cases, because that's not what cops are necessarily trained for. So we need to invest in those services to prevent the crisis to occur in the first place, look at co-responder models so that the de-escalation techniques that are needed to better resolve an incident is handled by those professionals. But I just got to say this, it has to be done in a strategic manner. That if you're talking about changing a system that's been operating this way for 50, 60 years, the notion that you can change in a one budget cycle by cutting the police department is, for lack of a better phrase, is dangerous and is irresponsible. This may be a 5-year process at the fastest, in which you're starting to make initial investments in social services. You're starting to see what impact it has on the requirement to have officers. You're starting to reduce the footprint of law enforcement and the enforcement of laws if necessary. And then you're going to, through attrition and through strategic funding decisions, we'll start transferring or reallocating funds so that maybe some time down the road, 3, 4, or 5 years down the road, you have built up social services, community services, you have reduced law enforcement in its footprint, you have defined the role that you want cops to play in a safety, in a community safety, you have the mechanism to still hold them accountable, because we talked about that roadmap. That's a better outcome than just working up today, the next budget cycle, saying, hey, give me $100 million so I can give to the community, when I don't think the community may not be ready yet to do that. The second part I'm concerned about with reinvestment is not a concern, but just something we need to think about is, unless you think cops are a separate group of human beings that are just different, which quite frankly, we're not, then part of the challenge with police officers is how they handle authority and power, right? And if you now take that authority and power, that's fine, but it means you're about to give it to someone else. What are the systems in place to make sure their implicit bias doesn't come up with the same harm that the policing system has, right? So for example, you want a bunch of mental health workers responding in the field to de-escalate, but if there's no diversity, if there's no checks and balance, that mental health worker may be more likely to call the police when they basically are dealing with a young man of color than let's say that they're not. And we see this in the school system, where because you have very few black male teachers, and people are afraid of the criminalization of men of color, young boys of color, that you have just arguments or just things that should be just considered as part of growing up and youthful exuberance, kids become in special ed classes, they become disciplined, they get suspended at higher rates because the teachers are actually afraid of their students. So even as we transition and reduce law enforcement, we need to understand why we have some of the problems we have, and if we're not addressing the structural racism that in this is our society, then we're just going to transfer a problem. Now, granted, these entities won't have a gun, and we'll have less harm with regards to death, but we'll still have a lot of structural harm.
Yeah. I really appreciate that response. I've only heard one other person mention the ways in which, you know, the broader society has these issues too. And so if we transfer this responsibility, we're transferring it to another institution that might have similar problems. So you're less likely to have a gun, but it can produce other outcomes that are just as problematic. So thank you for that. My final question before I turn it over to my colleague is many reform measures that are recommended to eliminate police brutality and reduce inequitable treatment by law enforcement, and specifically against residents of communities of color. They have little, if any, empirical data supporting their efficacy. And you mentioned earlier evidence-based approaches. So for instance, implicit bias training, the more research we do, the more evidence there is that it actually doesn't do much to change behavior of police. It might, you know, temporarily change how they think, but in terms of actions on the ground, it doesn't do much. And there are also questions about body-worn cameras. The hope is for greater transparency and accountability, but more studies than not suggest that it doesn't move us forward. And yet, a lot of these approaches are approaches that a number of cities and municipalities are embracing. What's your response to that? How do we overcome these? And so what I would say is that these are kind of reforms that nibble around the edges at best. It makes it look as if we're making some effort to produce some kind of change, but it doesn't really often move the bar very much. If that is, well, one, I want to see what you think about that. And then if you agree, or to whatever extent you agree, how would we overcome what I think are significant barriers to transformational change that, you know, we seek, and that this moment, at least at some point, seemed like it offered?
Right. So two things immediately come to mind. One was a conversation I had with the late Pat Murphy some years ago. He's a former commissioner in New York. And he posed a question. He was doing a training in Montgomery County, Prince George's County, excuse me, that was entering into a consent decree. And he posed a question to the commanders about law enforcement. Are we a profession or a vocation? And I think what he was starting to do was to start to push back on the law enforcement profession. Chris Stone is also on a call right now, did an article about towards a new professionalism, talking about this national coherence to a body of standards. We're probably right now, law enforcement is probably the least studied profession that has so much power that there's no professional standards that say, let's say like it is in medical or law. I can't, as a police chief, I can't be disbarred, and there's no license for you to take, depending on the state I'm at, which means I can literally embrace a program that Harvard just basically did a 2-year study on and said was harmful, and nothing will happen to me, right? And depending on how I spin it and offer it, right, it may look like the chief gave it a good shot and he moved on. So part of this idea of where we're heading is I think we have to raise the level that law enforcement is a profession, that we need to embrace a national body of standards. Now, from coming from the federal government after so many years, you got to know there's a distinction between national standards and federal standards. I'm not talking about the federalizing of police. I'm talking about the professionalizing of the police industry, so that more and more my decisions as a chief will be based on evidence and research. If I go to the hospital right now and have appendicitis, I expect my doctor, regardless of how big the hospital is, whether I'm in the south, the east, the north, the west, it doesn't matter. There's only so many ways he or she can treat me. And if they don't, I get to hold them accountable for going against the best evidence in science. With 16,000 agencies, we just can't say that with law enforcement. So we do need to create this idea of being more evidence-based. And so we now embrace things because they sound good. We probably bought more body cameras before the first study was done. I'm guilty as charged. I did a project recently with Harvard and Stanford about technology, because guilty as charged, I was one of those chiefs that I went to the conference and we went down to the exhibit hall, and you had your pieces of chocolate, a little glass of wine, a toy that looks good and is shiny, and you can tell me how I can get federal funds to pay for it. I'm buying stuff I have not a clue of what it does other than it's cool, and I don't have to pay for it. And not realizing that it's collecting data that I didn't realize I wanted collected. It's violating all kinds of surveillance rules and regs. So more and more, we decided to come up with a checklist so that people can make these decisions. So we're buying cameras, gunshot detection systems, license plate readers, facial recognition before the study and the research is done. Part of the problem is that, I would say this as a former chief, is it's hard to say, please wait 2 years for the study to come out while people are dying every day on the streets. And sometimes all people want is some kind of action. So it requires me to then not do so much evidence-based policing as much as it is promising practices. So in other words, so this worked in New York, maybe it'll work here, I gotta try something. And so I think one of the ways we respond to that is that that the federal government should play a significant role in this. If we like a decentralized model of policing, if we like 16,000 police departments with the vast majority being 50 or smaller, then the only way to sustain that and maintain a high level profession is to make extreme investments on the behalf of the federal government to continue the research, development of best practices, so that we now can have a profession that is guided by science and evidence and research, not emotions or anecdotes or since it worked last year, it must work this year, and have processes to actually test it, to have journals for it to be published, right? Peer review. So we're not there yet, I think, although the last 10 years, I've seen more police departments partner with academia than I've seen in the last 35 years. I see more and more that relationship becoming stronger and more as chiefs looking towards that direction. I will say this, I tried this and I failed. When I was the director of the COPS office, I submitted a program in the budget. I was able to convince the president of the White House to say yes, but Congress told me no. And it was called the Community-Oriented Policing, it was called COPMED, Management Education Development Program. And it was the concept that we would partner with a couple universities and develop a Master's of Science in Community Policing. That we then would get cohorts of senior commanders that would basically get scholarships to go to this university and start learning the true part of policing. The science, the research, the best practices, right? They would do an internship with the Department of Justice, publish, do some kind of publication. The idea would be that a new generation of chiefs would not just have a lot of training, they would actually have the formal education, that they would understand statistical research. They would understand certain things, right? More than just to be in the, instead of just being the technical expert in policing, you now are an executive director, you're a CEO, you're a CFO, you're an executive, you're running a nonprofit, because more than likely, though, if all you have is your city's budget, you're not going to be successful. The role of a police chief has changed so dramatically that we thought this would help professionalize it. Like I said, I couldn't get it done, but that's where we need to head, is to take a new generation that way. The second part I got to say is this, and I don't have the academic credentials to push back, but I'm gonna do it anyway, so take a little bit of executive privilege, is some of the research that I read, I think is flawed because the basic construct, the basic research question is already biased. Like I've seen a lot of the studies on community policing, and once again, the study itself is suggesting, well, when I compare the enforcement, once again, to what they say is community policing, which is nothing more than community engagement, nothing is different. Well, that would make sense if community policing was simply community engagement. So I don't question your methodology, but your question was just flawed, because taking a bank robber to jail is community policing. Solving a homicide is absolutely community policing, but using crime reduction strategies that are evidence-based, whether it's ceasefire, focused deterrent, or other things, is also community policing, as is playing basketball with kids. So some of the studies, I think, are not flawed, but they're also biased because they start with a flawed or a biased research question, in my opinion.
So I could ask you questions all day, all night, and I will probably figure out some way to get you back here so that I could have a conversation with you. But I have to turn it over to my colleague, Chris, and then we're going to open it up for the audience to ask questions that they have.
Well, thank you, Ron, so much for being here and being the first guest at our inaugural set of sessions. Your experience and wisdom is really terrific. So I wanted to ask about three things. Lots of discussion about needing to hold police officers accountable. In some cases, it's a discussion about getting rid of or changing qualified immunity. In other cases, it's about certification and decertification. What are your thoughts about sort of a productive way for us to change, so that police officers actually can be held accountable for their behavior, even if they haven't, um, engaged in actual crime.
So I understand why there's a lot of focus on holding police officers accountable. We need to do that. I don't know if the elimination of qualified immunity, there may be some reform with qualified immunity. There's some legitimate reasons why any jurisdiction would want immunity for certain things that officers do in the lawful scope of their work. The decertification I support greatly, more so that you don't have cops that are fired in one jurisdiction can bounce around, leave states, do other things. But here's one thing I will say this. I think there's a difference between police reform versus policing reform. And to me, I think we need to look at this as systems more so than the individuals. Police reform is the bad apple theory. The vast majority of cops are very good. There's a few bad apples, and we can simply hold them accountable. This will change the outcome. The harm we're seeing is way too much for that to be a few bad apples. What we have are systemic reforms that are needed that are bigger than the individual officers. And so policing reform goes to the heart and soul of how we police, why we police, what we have officers engaging in. And I'll give you an example why that's important before I go after the officers or even the union. In New York, stop and frisk was not a police reform issue. The officers didn't come up one day and say, hey, you know what? I think I personally want to do stop and frisk. This was a system. This was a mandate. Assignments were based on that. Incentives were provided for that. Disincentives for not complying with it. And when it went south and we saw the disparities, our initial response was to say all the cops are either racist or they need training, versus the idea that in this case, the union actually told the commissioner that they should not be doing it and that their quota system would have negative impacts, not just on the rank and file, but the community as well. So too often we focus on police reform, what we're really looking at is the policing reform. And it makes me think of the 85-15 rule that Deming has, which is, and I'm gonna paraphrase, is 85% of any effective organization is based on the systems in which people operate, 15% being that of the people themselves. Going back to my earlier comment, if you have bad organizational structure and system, then even good cops have terrible outcomes and bad cops get to hide, operate with impunity, and flourish. And so a good system then holds those individual cops accountable by its nature. And then you still need the decertification and you still need the accountability, but just increasing the amount of cops we charge for the tragic shootings we see, or firing a few more, is not going to address the harm that the industry is providing, because the harm is bigger than a few bad apples. It's not a few bad apples, and it's the whole barrel itself is rotten. So it's now time to replace the barrel so that apples have a fair shot of surviving. So I agree with the police reform part, but I think I'm more focused on that we need to stress policing reform so that we're focusing on what's more likely to impact cops. And a good policing system creates a culture then in which cops do not accept misconduct, that cops will report their colleagues because now they're bringing their image, their system, their culture, their reputation at risk. That's the kind of system you want right now, not every man, every woman for themselves, right? And every time now a cop makes a mistake, even if you know it's a mistake, you have to defend it because it's us versus them, it's blue versus black, and no one understands me but myself. All of these things are created when we're allowing police to operate with a culture that's somehow insular from the rest of the community and doesn't have the kind of accountability in the culture of the system that's required.
Thank you. That was a rich answer. You mentioned unions. As you well know, police unions are often an obstacle to reform. And I gather in Los Angeles now, they seem to be quite successful at blocking change. Unclear what's happening in Massachusetts, but the unions are certainly pushing back hard on a lot of ideas. How do we make them partners in this?
The first thing I would say is we need to understand the role of the union. And what I mean by that is getting mad at the union for defending an officer is like getting mad at a defense attorney for defending a client. That's their job. So why would you take that personally? Why is that somehow representative other than that's why if I'm a union member, I pay my dues? I expect for the union to provide me counsel, and I expect for them to support me. They're not the police department, they're not the police chief, they're not the community advocacy groups. They should care about the community because they're officers within it, but understanding the role of the union. The second part is I don't think the union are the obstacles to reform. I think the union contracts are. And to that extent, that allows the union to then use that to be obstacles in reform. But we also have to remember that the union contracts are not imposed upon by the union. They're agreed upon by the city or by the governing body for whatever jurisdiction it has it. So as I think more and more civil rights groups are starting to realize that and are starting to shift their focus. Because you could have 100,000 people demonstrate because of the George Floyd tragedy, and that's very much needed. I hope they continue. This is how we make change. But then when you go to the council meeting about how to ratify the contract for the police union, there's 2 people in the audience. Or when you go to the budget to talk about the allocation of services for that budget year, there's no one in there. And then people say, well, we wanted to fund. Well, you wanted to fund a month after we just allocated. So I think advocacy has to advance to the point where recognizing what kind of conditions in a contract or provisions are obstacles to reform. And right now, there are many that are, I'll be very candid, they're beyond obstacles. I think they're nothing less than obstruction of justice. The notion that you can't talk to me for 48 hours after I kill somebody is absolutely ridiculous. And that's not a working condition. That's an obstruction, right? And if I were most district attorneys, they should ignore that and do what they think is the best interest for the case. But we negotiated that because in many cases, we want to negotiate certain working conditions for financial benefits for the city. The notion that I can't discipline somebody under certain circumstances, or that I can't share that discipline with the community, or that somehow the record is so top secret that no one knows what a cop has done before. Or I've had a case where the person has been deemed to be in violation of Brady, was indicted, although they were acquitted, but was sustained from a violation. A Brady attachment was there, which means they can't testify in court, and arbitrators still order them back to the department. So now I got a couple of cops that I can't even put in the field, but I have to pay them as cops, and I have to use them as cops. So we have a lot of reform to do in these contracts. I think the way for us to engage the union is, one, is challenge what has happened over the last 20 or 30 years with regard to unions contract. I would still say I'm still one of those optimists that I think collaborative responses are always better than individuals. Quit demonizing them as being devils, and understand that the union is like whether you're the Teamster or you're the Fraternal Order of Police, you're going to fight for the collective bargaining rights of your people. You're going to fight to get them as much as you can. And so recognize that, but bring them to the table and make it clear that some of these provisions have now, whether intended or not, have now contributed to the obstacles of reform and to why our communities have no trust, why we're not viewed with any legitimacy. There are some, and I've seen some of the presidents, I've worked in jurisdictions that individuals in the union are obstructionists, right? There are some where you look at people in the union, they are racist, they're ignorant, and they're dangerous. And so also we need to know that in many cases, the union does not always represent the voice of the rank and file. It may represent the voice of the union, of those who are running the union, not necessarily the other 95% that work in the streets every day. So I think that's a big issue. I think we have to take it head on, but I think we have to take it on in a collaborative way where we bring the union to the table, we renegotiate some of the contracts, we make sure that whatever we do, we still protect the due process that officers are entitled to. Some things people want are just not appropriate. The biggest one that I hear people get mad at is when there's a controversial shooting is how could you pay the person, right? And so understanding why things occur, understanding due process, understanding, labor law would be very beneficial. But there's an opportunity there, and I'm starting to see more and more unions right now realizing it and wanting to sit at the table to help reform, because obviously they know what's going to happen with them or without them.
Great. Well, I have many more questions, but I think we should give others an opportunity to ask some questions. So I believe somebody else is going to manage that. But thank you so much, and hope in the future to have some continue our conversation.
So we have a number of questions queued up. I'm gonna list out the folks whose names are already here. Sharon Sherrill has a question that she listed quite early in the talk. Then Richard Myers, Madeline Smith. Madeline, if you could just choose one of those, we don't have time for you to get through the three, but I appreciate the engagement for sure. Ann Jordan, Chris Stone, and then Brenda Bond. So Sharon Sherrill, please.
Hi, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm really angry, so I hope my questions will come across in an open way, thinking again about what's going on with Breonna Taylor, but not just limited to that case. Really, I want us to push to look outside of the US context, particularly because policing is actually a colonial import when you think about policing in mostly African nations. And for you know, however folks want to identify, African nations have basically community policing because the police look exactly like Black African people, right? And I still believe that complete abolition needs to happen in that context. So I don't believe in reform. I've been in spaces with restorative justice, transformative justice, and other accountability processes in the school to prison pipeline, and it was a tragedy. So my main question really is about the academic incentives to really be imaginative, right? To have these conversations, because I think that it is possible. Safety is inherently an anti-Black paradigm. So I think it is possible to think back to how our people of African descent were organizing themselves before the colonizers came and started kidnapping our people. I think there is a academic exercise to be had, and Harvard is the wealthiest university in the world, and I think, you know, people should be able to engage with that and all the resources at folks' disposal. So my question is about how do we let go of the idea of safety, and how do we use the academic resources in front of us to make sure that like young Black kids don't have to go and burn the police stations to make a point, right? Like, because if we keep trying to like run away from this, like police are not going to exist after this. And if we keep trying to redeem them, then we're going to push our people to extremes that are going to further criminalize them. So it's really about what type of academic spaces can we create so that people can have a conversation around violence and have these conversations and create the worlds that we need.
So it's a great question. And I think it goes to the point I made earlier about the idea of abolitionists is that tinkering around with reform for many people is just insufficient. You're trying to fix a system that's not broke. It was a system that was designed to do certain things. The big challenge with abolishing it for the US is you're trying to fix the plane while you're flying it, right? So we've created this plane that's in the air, is going a certain, and we now want to reconstruct it, and that's going to be, it can be done, but that's the challenge. I would say this as far as the research. If we're going to reimagine public safety, the greatest challenge to the reimagination process is the abandonment of how things are right now, how they have been, right? That's just human behavior. Can we get past of what we used to do? And what I've learned nothing over the 35 years in this game is what we used to do, most people can't even tell you why, just that we used to do it, and therefore it must be okay. And that's not true. So a couple of things I think would have to happen, I think where a Harvard and academic could come in, is what are the lessons from other countries? We just, for the first time, start looking at other countries with regards to force. Why do we shoot so many people where others do not? And so we understand the gun culture, but one of our national associations looked at it from a knife point of view. We still shoot a lot of people with knives, where Scotland, they don't. So what's happening? What's the culture different? I think a couple of things that need to occur for this academic program. One is you have to create an environment where you have to start, and there's one project and I hate to say this, but at Yale, called Square One, where the idea is you start from the square one, forget about everything you know, and what would it look like if you were building it today, right? The other part is I think we can't build anything until we do what I think the country has failed to do. And we can learn this from South Africa. We have not gone through our truth and reconciliation process. We are still sitting here trying to rewrite history with a president that's trying to deny history because we don't like what it says. And because we have not gotten to truth-telling and reconciliation, it's very hard to move forward. Mandela said, only the truth can put the past to rest. So we're still fighting over what the past actually means. And so how do you go forward? Once we get into the truth-telling and the reconciliation, I think maybe we have it closer to now trying to identify what does safety look like. And safety, and you're so right about that, safety meaning community safety, not safety against whom. Because once you add the word, once safety means against something, then it's going to get back to those biases where people have a certain criminality attached to color. So I think that is something that the world of academia can get into and create that environment of what would a public safety system in 2025 look like if we were to build it from square one. If we were to look at it, would it be uniform officers? Would it be the same militarized training? Would it be this? Would it be community members? How does it look? Would it be resident? It's all, whatever the question is going to be. And I think we have to do that. The big challenge would be is how do you get people out of that concept of what it used to be? But I agree with your assessment 100%. And you didn't sound mad, by the way.
Richard Myers.
Hi, Ron. Good to see you. It's been a while. My question has to do with the issue of standards like you brought up, and you're absolutely right. There are somewhere between 16,000 and 18,000 agencies in the US, and none of them do everything exactly like their neighbor. However, there is a now international credentialing body that requires agencies to live up to a set of standards, increasingly which are evidence-based. I had the privilege of serving on that commission for 9 years, including chairing it the last 3 years. However, here's the paradox. Its strength is that it's voluntary. It's transformative. Traditional thinking police chiefs are never going to get their department accredited. They're going to resist the standards, they're going to fight it, and so it becomes a transformational thing that the entire agency at every level has to buy into. Now there's rumors that certain federal agencies are thinking of mandating some type of credentialing or accreditation for agencies, which goes completely against the strength of CALEA's voluntary program. However, right now, less than 10% of police agencies nationally are accredited.
Right.
So rather than mandate, how can we incentivize and let that be a transformational process that can lead to changes from the top all the way through an agency?
So it's good to see, Rick. I don't know if I agree with you about the mandate. I understand it's pushing back on the concept, but the numbers are so low and have been with CALEA. Does a great job, but the numbers are low because it's hard work. Talk to any agency that's go through it. It's not a rubber stamp process. You got to, as they say, you got to put the work in, right? So people don't do that unless they're serious. But here's what I would say, if not mandating, would be I would say one of the things that's being talked about right now from a DC point of view is making it a requisite of funding of grants, right? Going back to incentivizing grants. One of the things that you always certify, you remember you were chief in a few places you were at, is you always certify that you will not use federal funds to discriminate or violate any of the titles that go with discrimination. Well, a furtherance of that would be then you need to be certified. You need to be credentialed. And so if you want that, $25 million COPS grant, that $50 million, whatever the grants may be, that would be one way that people can be incentivized. Or what happens a lot, if you want to start and you want to keep it voluntary, and you came to me, what I would do is give preference points, right? So in other words, I won't take it away from you because in some cases, I'm always cautious that if you don't give it to an agency that needs help, then the community suffers more than the police department changes, right? There's a flip side of that coin, but you can give incentive points that says if you're accredited, you get more points towards your application, or if you're committed to doing that, you do that. The other part I would say, when we did the President's Task Force, and I learned this one, Rick, I think you did this as well when I was a city manager for a short period of time, is to link the accreditation to the risk management part of the city, right? Now, they're taken out of the police department in the sense that my insurance premiums, my deductibles, my payouts, right? The things that the mayor and the council are very concerned about are, you get this like any other insurance company or actuarial that you do, that you have lower payouts and lower risk when you're accredited. And so a lot of these either insurance companies or JPAs that cover small cities provide grants actually to do CALEA, right? Provide grants to have cameras, to provide grants to have tasers, because they've done the actuarials to know that you'll reduce litigation. So I think you hit it from it. You get the risk managers, the county councils, the risk management pools to incentivize it by giving grants, by lowering deductibles, by lowering premiums, because it's going to reduce payouts. And you also do it through the feds, where if you want grants, they either get incentives for having it or that you disqualify for certain grants. I think at some point, to become a police department, we should think about making it mandatory, Rick, in the sense that you can't be a crime lab unless you're certified. And so if you can't mess around and test drugs or DNA, then why would you have the ability to take life and take people's freedom and democracy and not have any accountability other than the individual chief or system that's in the city? I just think that we may want to have that discussion.
So thank you for that. So I'm hoping, Ron, that you'll stay and respond to 4 questions, and we'll call it. So it would be Madeline first, and Madeline, I need you to choose one of those 3 questions you have listed there. Anne, Chris, and then Brenda.
Let's keep in mind, I went first for a reason, so you have nothing to compare it to. And by the time you do, you don't forget about what I said. So go ahead.
Thanks for being here. It's been awesome to hear from you. My question's about the work you've done with the Task Force on 21st Century Policing. I know you mentioned the work kind of stalled after 2016, but I'm curious if there are cities or programs you might point to that have carried the mantle forward at the state and local level, and what you think about when you're thinking about what success looks like there. And related, if you're seeing any data gaps at the national level as you're trying to evaluate these things.
So it's a great question. And we're at the 5, this is the 5th year since the report was released. And I'm proud to announce that we have, thanks to the Joyce Foundation, we have a project with the Joyce Foundation, the National Police Foundation, to measure exactly that. Now, what has been the impact of this report? From my point of view, but I'm biased, has been a similar document that as I track it through Google alerts and anecdotes, I'm hearing more, agencies trying to stay the course, although there may be some changes in DC, but we're not going to measure. We're going to measure it through surveys with chiefs, looking at what departments are doing, what's the, how they've implementing the reforms. And I think the lesson there will be not just for this report, would be whenever the government engages in any type of report or its community, is how do you turn that action into that report into action, into something that's measurable versus just another report. So right now, anecdotally, I think it has continued to be a seminal document in policing. I don't have the evidence behind it, but I do say this: it was an honor to watch, to see a lot of the chiefs that were committed to those principles stay firm to those principles, even though there's been a political shift. And a good example would be with immigration. A lot of the chiefs, you wouldn't have seen this 30, 40 years ago. A lot of the chiefs were saying, you can take away our grants if you want, but I refuse to enforce immigration laws because it will disrupt my community. It will cause me to lose my legitimacy in my community. You have, regardless of what people are saying from DC, is that these chiefs are holding firm to their own core values and those things that they have embraced was to the best interest of the community. That is the beauty of a decentralized system, that not even the Attorney General, when I was a police chief, can make me do anything. He or she can incentivize me, they can provide grants, but if that person wants to go in an opposite direction, I still have the ability with my community to disagree and not go there. And right now, so you got the federal government suing departments trying to get them to force them to do things or take their grants, and they're losing in court. So I think it's been a positive impact, but I don't think it's been enough to address some of the issues that we talked about today. It's just, it shows that people go to it. One thing we are seeing, without getting into a lot of the early research, is that whenever there's a tragedy, we see a surge of people going back to the report, right? So it's steady at one point, then a tragedy occurs, it spikes, everybody's downloading, wants a copy of it and talks about it and calls everybody up. Then it slows down, it goes back to that idea of these moments versus a movement. So I think we need to do, I'm looking forward for this research to show what kind of impact it really has had.
Okay, Ann Jordan.
Hi, Chief. Ann Jordan from the state of Maine. One area, I'm the former commissioner of public safety of the state of Maine. And so one of the areas that I was very concerned about in talking to my colleagues from across the country is I don't see any research on the impact of the different types of structures that police academies can take and how that then impacts on the street, on the road, with leadership, and with the way the officers respond to certain circumstances. Can you comment on that and where you feel that kind of evidence may or may not need to be developed to actually achieve real change here?
I sure will. I can't think of the study offhand, but I know 20, 30 years ago, there was still a major debate about the different types of academy. One being the boot camp mentality, right? The one when I went in, you know, you pretty much got your head shaved, got yelled at. Everything was about push-ups and you know, that kind of uniform inspections, to where most academies now, or a lot of academies, I won't say most, a lot of academies are now affiliated with higher learning institutions and are accredited. And so they're part of that world. I think what we're finding is that militarized methodology had the unintended consequence of creating militarized thoughts, right? And unlike the military, although we're uniformed, we're paramilitary, and we have a structure that requires command and control, you are still, you know, I used to tell people when I was in the military, is I don't want to hire a 17-year-old private. I want to hire a 22-year-old officer that thinks on his or her own, that makes decisions, that is analytical, that understands the mission. And so that may look different. So I think, you know, that transition has been helpful. The other thing that I've always advocated for as a former academy director is the push for the state peace officer standards and training commissions that govern most academies, is to really take a look at the curriculum so that the curriculum is reinforcing the behaviors that you are looking for. So for example, when I went to the academy, it was amazing to me how many hours of the academy was for firearms. We were shooting literally every single day. And when I asked why, I was advised because these are perishable skills and the liability if you're not certified in training your firearm. And I had to ask the questions, when's the last time we lost a lawsuit? Because you shot somebody in the leg versus the shoulder versus why'd you shoot him to begin with? And so, and if it is perishable, then maybe that's more of an investment you do in advanced officer training as a continual thing to keep them updated and certified. Where in academy, it should be about thinking, critical thinking, decision-making, de-escalation, procedural justice, implicit, all the good things that we talked about. So there's some huge opportunities in that arena. I will say this, one of the projects that we started before I left the administration was with the group called IATLIST, which is a very long acronym for the International Association of Directors of Law Enforcement Standards and Training Commissions. And these are all the post directors that come together, the states. And we gave them a grant to take the President's Task Force report, to look at the recommendations on each pillar, to turn those into lesson plans and curriculum, to then add that to their academies, add that to their in-service training. And that's the best way you can get to 16,000 agencies. You don't get them through individual, you get through them through 50 states and then 5 or 6 territories, right? So now if the state requires this, then in California, all 400 cities have to do it. So I think there is probably some more study to look at. I think what's probably required is research to look at what impact the current curriculum has. In other words, what impact it has on performance. Does the academy produce the 21st century police officer, or are we hiring a 21st century candidate and then producing a 20th century outcome? I don't know the answer, and I think that would be one to be worthy of research to see whether or not we're advancing our calls or whether or not we're going backwards. And the same thing with the field training program, right? Is to make sure the field training program, if you have a great academy, does not undermine the actual police academy. So this is the area where you look into a lot of departments, especially with investigation of police departments. This is the area, and you know that the academy, the field training officer, and the first line supervisors are probably some of the 3 top keys that you would take a look at.
Thank you.
So now we have Chris Stone. Hello. It's your turn.
Thanks a lot. I'm sorry it's dark in this room. It's almost 11 o'clock at night here in the UK. So thanks for doing this, Ron. Like you, I've been thrilled to see the new movement for replacing the police systems that have, as you say, just been doing what they've been designed to do. But I'd love to hear more about your thoughts about what radical reconstruction might look like in practice beyond the 21st century report. One idea you haven't mentioned yet is the equivalent of charter schools for policing, taking the decentralization of American policing and instead of letting it be a weakness of our stricter, actually maybe turn it into a strength. Essentially having charter police departments that give communities access to city, county, state funds, just like a charter school can get access to those public school funds, but run the school themselves, run the police department in a city, have the community run it directly. It's not a crazy idea. Harvard University has its own police agency, right, sitting in the middle of Cambridge, Massachusetts, with police powers from the state. And it gets to control that. A lot of business improvement districts, so businesses have figured out how to get their own police departments, tie their dispatch system into this big city dispatch system, and still run their own police departments. Why shouldn't Black and brown communities across the country that feel the police are occupying armies have the same ability those business improvement districts and Harvard University has to be able to have their own police department? There was Brian is gonna, I hope, throw up a little picture on the screen here. We'll see if he can get it up. That looks like an NYPD car, but that's Muslim Community Patrol in New York, a local effort to try and protect mosques who didn't think they could trust the protection from the NYPD. So we have these movements in communities. Can we think of that as a progressive way of beginning to experiment with more radical community control?
So let me start with that one first, and then I'll go to the part about the your first question. I think that's what I mean by getting rid of the constraints of our past thinking. Sometimes the greatest limitation to our creativity is our own experience. And so I like that idea. I think what would happen is one of the reasons why law enforcement can do what it does, in a sense that not change as fast, because we have a monopoly. You have no choice, right? There's no competition for my services, right? You may fire an individual CEO or individual member, but the entities keep. And look, if we were private businesses, we would have bankrupt a long time ago with some of our success rates, hit rates, right? We would not be very, very good. And some things we're great at. So not to compare it to a business, but I like the idea. And I think that's the kind of stuff that has to be put on the table. It sounds radical. Someone's going to say, Chris, it sounds crazy, until you start thinking about it and go, what makes it so crazy? The key would have to be is it happens in many ways right now, but it happens for more people that can afford it, because they'll do it outside of the city's budget, right? If you're in a rich neighborhood, you know what, forget the city's budget. We're going to get together and have our own security, gated community, private, just like private schools. So if you do it through a charter process, which is the way that you would still access public funds, right? The public funds were going to go for that policing anyway. I think that's a brilliant idea. I like it tremendously. And I think that's the kind of things when we talk about reimagining, it just can't be just changing the policies, right? Now, with regards to the 21st Century Policing Task Force report, where I think that comes in is I don't think that's a part of reimagination, because that's going to be limiting. That is, once you decide what the role of the police is going to be, is how you make sure whatever that role is going to be, that it's appropriate. That may still come in and how you shape it. And what other industry is, the industry I think, you and I might have had this discussion too, Chris, is I think about the medical profession, right? And how's it changed? Two professions that have changed dramatically, in my opinion, medical profession and fire services. With the medical profession is, if you go into a hospital right now, and I told you with 1,000 employees, probably about 100 to 150 would be doctors. The vast majority would be other professionals. If you ever spend a night, if you go into the hospital and spend a night there, you may see your doctor once a day. Your doctor will not give you medication, is not going to give you an aspirin. You have PAs, LVNs, RNs. You have a lot of staff that can do those services that are trained specifically for those services. What we have in policing is we have doctors giving out aspirins. We use cops for everything, towing cars, showing up on calls that have nothing to do with the enforcement of law. And as a result, we inadvertently put power and authority where it's not needed. And in some cases, it results in the criminalization of that activity. And so to be able to change the department, say if I tell you I got 1,000 employees inside my police department right now, 800 be cop. Imagine if I told you 200 were cop. Because the other 800 are people that are going to actually solve problems like mental health workers and civilians that can take reports and analysts that can link burglaries together more effectively than a detective can. So there's all those ways of thinking through, and the fire service has figured out they have to change their whole system because putting out fires is not their number one job. It's medical. So now most of them have paramedics or some other connection. So I think this is going to force law enforcement to make those changes and evaluate of why we do what we do, why we have so many. But going to your second piece, I love the idea of something as radical as that. I just want to share one thing is, history, and I'm going to paraphrase it and probably get it wrong for all your history majors, so I apologize ahead of time. But when Eisenhower, in trying to deflect where the invasion of D-Day was going to be, built a fake army around Patton. And so he realized he needed help to do this. So he went to Hollywood because he realized that generals were incapable, or the experience of them could not be creative enough to give them a solution. They went to Hollywood. If you ever see them, they show an officer hold up a tank with one hand because they did all the Hollywood props, right? Like a Hollywood person would do. So now when the Germans flew across, they could see tanks and planes, and they were just balloons. And the idea would be is in order to come up with that creative solution, he had to step out of the realm of the expertise that he was so used to doing. So the solution to this is not going to be from me, because I'm still very much, I try, but it's going to have to be from people that's on this call and people like you that can think outside of that box and then force us to pause a moment and go, hey, that's not really a bad idea. It's crazy, but it's not bad.
So final question for Brenda Bond from.
Thank you, Sandra, and Ron for hanging around. I realize I'm between this and the end of the session, so thank you so much. Some of what I think I've just been thinking about is, you just reiterated, Ron, about thinking outside the box. I am really interested in how to bridge research and practice using what we know from or have learned from other disciplines. And I'm a community psychologist, but many of you on the call know I've been working with police for 25 years. Practically speaking, how do we make other disciplines and what we know from other disciplines appealing to a pretty stubborn institution and even criminology is kind of stubborn and very much laser focused on their own sort of way of thinking. I'd love just briefly commenting, and we could chat later about how do we bring management studies, or how do we bring community psychology or other disciplines to the conversation about how to improve or rethink policing and public safety, community engagement, and those kinds of things. Thank you very much.
Good to see you, Brenda. If I'm listening to the question appropriate, I think in talking to my colleagues over the years, and one of the hesitancy and apprehension of this partnership between law enforcement and academia is historically, and there's been a lot of changes over the last decade, probably the last 20 years, but historically, it would be the researcher that just came in, evaluated a program, and told the chief why his program didn't work, and he's a knucklehead, and shame on you for even trying, right? Or read something in the paper. The other part is that I think we've evolved past that. You have enough partnerships now. Yourself, Chris, Malcolm. There's so many others. I could probably think of just Bragas that are working closely with the departments that they have a legitimate relationship. So the first thing I think researchers have to do is help me understand how it's going to. I'm going to be a little selfish. I'd like to contribute to a larger concept in my profession because I'm a professional, but it would be nice to help me how you can help me as the chief of this department and what I'm going to do, right? And make sure that the researchers you use, this is going to be something different. I think there should be a class on this of how to engage law enforcement as a researcher, right? You just can't take any researcher, throw them inside a police department and think it's going to work. I tease David Kennedy because I'm so shocked they even let him inside the door. half of the places he go to, but they love, they end up liking him, and because he has a reputation. I'm teasing it because there's little things, but there's little nuances of learning how to engage with law enforcement and really walking them through. When I was in East Palo Alto, there was a hesitancy to work with academia, and obviously right next to us was Palo Alto with Stanford. And over the years, this community, which was 90% of color, thought that academics simply came in to treat them as an experiment, a test tube. Let's see how these Black folk keep killing each other and how they can't control themselves and all the other stuff. And so when I came in and started partnerships, it took me a while to convince them that this wasn't another exploitation of the community as much as it was using data from the community to get grants, to get funding, to provide information that we could use. And it took some pretty good researchers. One is your friend, Sarah Lawrence, and others, but she was at UC Berkeley, to actually come into the community, talk to people, explain what they were doing, why it was important, and feel comfortable in this environment. So I think, because it's very much needed. So I would think that's the number one recommendation I would make, is make sure you know how to engage law enforcement.
Okay, so that has to be it. We have kept you longer than we promised we would keep you, but I have to tell you, I've just been blown away by your candor, how refreshing your responses have been, how much I've learned. Thank you so much for being willing to do this with us, and especially on such short notice. I hope you will come back and visit.
No problem. Can I make one announcement if you don't mind?
Absolutely.
So to this idea of reimagining public safety, as you know, I mentioned the Square One project. There's projects all over the country. I mentioned the Joyce Foundation one with the President's Task Force. Noble, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, just announced a task force on reimagining public safety or community safety as well. This will be primarily law enforcement officers of color are going to try to sit down and say, look, how do we develop a roadmap so that our colleagues, that we can get the profession open to the idea, like Chris was talking about reimagining, the impact that it has in the community, so that the process can be strategic and beneficial and not be counterproductive. So for those, if you can look it up right now, you learn more about it, but we may be reaching out for feedback, and part of the task force, we'll also be looking for, like you guys are doing, testimony from experts. And I see a lot of experts on the line here, so I'm looking forward to it. Just wanted to make that announcement, so thank you.
Excellent. And so why don't we all unmute, those of us who are left, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.